Hello everyone, here at OS Reviews. This is just a quick throwback comparison between the Nokia Lumia 710 and the Lumia 800. Both of these were phones that came out in 2011. They came out in the same year, and the 800 was meant as the flagship for Nokia at the time. This was among their first batch of Windows Phone smartphones, and the 710 was basically their budget offering and had a more conservative design. Pricing-wise, the 800 retailed for about 140 euros, so roughly $200, versus the 710, which retailed for less than 100 euros, and in the US, you could get it for $50 with a 2-year contract, which made it very affordable. Now, part of the reason why we're doing this video now is because the 710, as we discussed in a prior video, is actually one of the cheapest smartphones you can get, period, refurbished on Amazon or eBay. And I've picked up this one here for only $5. So underneath the hood, both of these phones are actually very similar, despite the fact there's a price and design difference. They both have a Snapdragon S2 processor clocked at 1.4 gigahertz. They both have 512 megabytes of RAM, and they both have 8 gigs of built-in storage, which were fine for running Windows Phone very smoothly, and they both ran on Windows Phone 7.5 Mango out of the box. They both have 3.7-inch capacitive touchscreen displays that have been treated by Corning Gorilla Glass for added endurance, but the 800 does have a slightly curved edges on the sides, which makes swiping feel a bit more premium, and does have an AMOLED panel which has deeper and more contrasty colors and blacks. So you can see that here versus the 710. It still has what Nokia calls ClearBlack technology, so the contrast is still very good for a LCD panel, but if you go into the main screen, you can see a difference in terms of the color. It's definitely not as punchy as on an AMOLED display putting it side by side. Otherwise, both phones have a pretty similar battery capacity as well. We have 1,300 milliamp hours versus 1,400 milliamp hours. And you can see on the back there is a difference in terms of the camera, and that's basically the only spec difference among the two. 5 megapixels versus 8 megapixels, and the 800 also has lens or glass by Carl Zeiss, so potentially image quality should be better. Also, when it comes to build, of course, we have a pretty big difference. The 800 is made entirely out of a unibody polycarbonate that gives it a more heft in the hand. It's actually heavier than the 710 and definitely feels more premium despite the fact that both are made out of plastic. There's a more simplistic design that is something we've come to expect from the Finnish manufacturer. The top also houses the 3.5mm headphone jack, along with slots that cover up the micro USB and SIM card tray, and there's just a speaker on the very bottom here. Versus the 710, which has a speaker located on the rear, which is made out of a soft touch rubber. The back cover is replaceable, which means you can hot swap the battery, which is actually a pretty neat feature, but it doesn't feel quite as solid. In terms of placement of volume keys on the side here and the camera key, they're pretty similar, but again, this is made out of plastic compared to made out of aluminum. Connectivity options are basically the same as well. Both phones have Wi-Fi, they have access to Bluetooth, they have GPS for Nokia Maps, turn-by-turn navigation, and that works pretty well. The performance, again, really is basically the same. They have the same 7.5 Mango operating system, which is optimized to run really well and smoothly, even on a single-core processor that these two phones both have. And with 512 megabytes of RAM, you'll be surprised at how well the interface in general works, even here in 2018. There's hardly a hiccup, no stuttering or lag at all, so everything just feels really fast and snappy compared to, say, Android. If it was running on a single core processor with 512 megabytes of RAM, it would definitely be extremely slow. Even here in 2018, if we take a look at an Android Go phone that's supposedly more optimized, it still definitely is slower when it comes to general navigation than on a Windows phone from all these years ago. So both phones still work perfectly fine when it comes to phone calls, but you're basically restricted to 3G internet speeds. The big thing about Windows phones is about productivity, so you can open up Office, and from here we're able to create, view, and edit Word, Excel, and PowerPoint files when on the fly, which is what kind of Microsoft were going towards at the time. They were catering this more towards business professionals than everyday consumers, so to speak, following the legacy of Windows Mobile smartphones. Otherwise, both phones can still browse the web decently, but because of the slower processing speeds and because web pages have become more complex over the years, they're not going to handle super complex sites all that well, as we saw in the retro review of the 710. It was unable to handle things like the New York Times without waiting pretty long, and if you had an outdated version of the browser, it wouldn't open up at all. So that is one limitation. Things like games, things like apps, you probably won't really want to go towards Windows phones anymore. So before we end this video, let's just take a quick look at, I guess, the cameras on both of these units. So again, 8 megapixels versus 5 megapixels on the 710 is really the difference that we're talking about. Carl Zeiss lens versus no Carl Zeiss branding. If we take a quick image of the same kind of object here, they both have access to dedicated camera shutter keys, which I do appreciate, and the interface is very much stock, so there hasn't been any tweaks made by Nokia at all on top of what Windows Phone is offering us here. So if we take a look at this image, we can see that the 800 definitely has a slightly brighter image. However, the 800's camera doesn't always come out on top, surprisingly. Even though it has more megapixels, if you zoom on in, they have a pretty similar level of overall detail for the most part. You'll also notice a much colder tint on the 800's camera as well as on its display, and because it is AMOLED, as you tilt it, it has a bluish hue, which is not quite as realistic looking as on the 710, which has a more yellowish tint that it's capturing more accurately to the real objects that we're seeing in front of us here. So in some scenarios, the 710's camera actually does produce more lifelike images that, again, some may prefer. LCD screens in general definitely are better calibrated for accuracy, even if they don't have as much contrast as AMOLED screens like the one on the 800. So that's more or less it as far as this really quick retro comparison between the Lumia 710 and 800. And on a budget-oriented Windows phone, you still got pretty similar performance back in the day to more expensive, higher-end models, which was interesting for this platform. Because aside from some minor quirks maybe in the camera and the display that aren't as good when you put it side by side, when you're using it in isolation, it really is already very capable. And when it comes to real performance, there isn't a difference between this and, again, something like the Lumia 800. So you can check out more details about both of these phones in the description below, but for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews, just a quick throwback comparison between the Lumia 800 and the 710.